under the deep stillness of the night sky. The Pleiades shimmer like a whisper from the ancient world. A cluster of stars that has stirred human wonder for tens of thousands of years. Why did civilizations separated by vast oceans and ages tell the same story about these seven sisters? And what hides behind that soft blue veil that even modern science continues to chase? If this sight awakens a question in you, a memory, or a feeling you cannot quite name, share it in the comments below. Your voice may reveal another piece of this enduring mystery. And now, what exactly is the Pleiades? And where does it sit in the boundless sea of the sky? Have you ever looked up at the night sky, seen a tiny handful of stars clinging together like a small island of light, and wondered why that little patch seems to whisper louder than all the others? That soft knot of blue-white sparks is what we call the Pleiades Star Cluster, and for thousands of years it has been less a group of suns and more a chorus of stories, myths, and quiet questions from the human heart. Astronomers describe it in simple terms as a young open cluster of hot blue stars in the constellation Taurus, about 440 light-years away. Yet when you step outside on a crisp night and see it hanging on the shoulder of the celestial bull, it feels more like a tiny lantern pinned to the sky, guiding both farmers and dreamers through the dark seasons of the year. Pleiades lies near what the ancients imagined as the neck and shoulder of Taurus the bull, not by accident, but because human imagination saw a proud animal leaning into the heavens, its massive body drawn from brighter stars and its delicate shoulder marked by this little cluster. The bull charges across the zodiac, and just where its strength meets its vulnerability, there sits this fragile bouquet of light, like a garland placed over the shoulders of a powerful being. In the quiet language of constellations, this placement turns Pleiades into an ornament, a jewel that softens the wildness of Taurus, reminding us that even in the most forceful parts of nature there is a touch of grace. Modern astronomers might talk about right ascension and declination, mapping its position precisely on charts. But when you simply tilt your head back and find Orion's belt, then follow the line of stars toward a small shimmering clump near a V-shaped pattern in Taurus, you are performing the same sky reading as shepherds, sailors, and priests did long ago. One of the reasons Pleiades is so easy to recognize is that it gathers its brightness into a small space, like a campfire in the wilderness of the sky. Carl Sagan once reminded us that the cosmos is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And Pleiades is a perfect example. It is a little pocket of improbably beautiful order in the randomness of scattered stars. Our eyes are drawn to patterns, especially to small clusters framed by darkness. So even people who know very little about constellations often find themselves asking an astronomer friend what that little bunch of lights is. Imagine a child walking with a grandparent on a cold evening, the older hand pointing up with a slow patience, tracing lines from the belt of Orion to the red eye of Aldebaran in Taurus, then finally to that little nest of stars on the bull's shoulder. In that moment, the sky stops being an abstract dome and becomes a storybook. And Pleiades is one of the first words the child learns in the language of the universe. Yet there is a puzzle here that has haunted storytellers and scientists alike. And it lives inside a very simple question. If most people can only see 6 bright stars in Pleiades, why has it been called the Seven Sisters in so many cultures? Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to say that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And perhaps this little arithmetic problem is the cosmos nudging us to pay closer attention. In Greek myth, The seven sisters are the daughters of Atlas and Pleione, pursued across the sky by the hunter Orion. One of the sisters, so the story goes, fell in love with a mortal man, or faded from shame and hid herself, which is why we now see only 6 strong stars while the 7th lingers faintly in the background. On the other side of the world, Aboriginal Australian traditions speak of a group of girls in the sky chased by a persistent male figure, with one girl separated or taken away, leaving 6 to shine more clearly. These are not faint, local coincidences. They are voices that have never met, telling nearly the same tale under entirely different horizons. Modern data from missions like Gaia suggest that in the distant past, one of the Pleiades stars called Pleione was farther from Atlas than it appears today, bright enough and separate enough that ancient eyes could distinguish it as a distinct point of light. Over tens of thousands of years, gravitational dances have brought their apparent positions closer together, so that to most human observers now the pair blends into a single glow, effectively hiding the 7th sister in plain sight. When you combine that with the fact that human eyesight varies wildly, with some people able to see 8 or even 9 stars in the cluster under perfect dark skies, you begin to understand how an astronomical evolution could turn into a myth of loss. Somewhere in our deep past, a hunter or a storyteller or a child noticed that a star which had always been counted was becoming harder to see. And because humans rarely let a mystery remain naked, they dressed it in narrative. The vanished sister cried, or loved, or fell, and the sky accepted the story as gently as it accepted the light. Think for a moment of a farmer in the ancient world, living without clocks or printed calendars, relying on the sky as the only reliable book of seasons. When Pleiades rose before dawn, it marked the time to prepare the fields. When it gleamed high at midnight, it signaled the approach of the darker half of the year. The cluster was not just a pretty ornament. It was a practical instrument, a cosmic bell that rang out silent warnings and promises about planting and harvest. If one of those familiar stars gradually faded from easy view, it might have felt as unsettling as losing a digit on a trusted clock, a reminder that even the firmest patterns in nature shift over time. From that unease, stories of the missing sister bloomed, offering emotional meaning where there had only been celestial mechanics. As a scientist, I am trained to talk about mass, temperature, spectral type, to say that these stars are young, only about 100 million years old, glowing blue because they burn hot and fast. I can explain how the dust around them scatters blue light, creating a reflection nebula that gives photographs of Pleiades that dreamy, misty veil. But as a human being, I cannot ignore the way this tiny group of suns seems to gather not only gas and dust, but also memories, fears, and hopes from people who never met yet shared the same sky. When I stand outside with a telescope and invite strangers to look at Pleiades for the first time, there is often a small gasp, not because the object is huge or spectacular, but because it feels intimate, like peeking into a box of old family jewels and realizing they do not belong only to you. The lesson I draw from this cluster is a quiet one, but powerful. Pleiades shows us that science and story are not enemies, but two ways of holding the same light. The precise position of the cluster in the shoulder of Taurus, its role as one of the easiest star patterns to recognize, and the tension between 6 visible stars and the name 7 sisters all invite us to ask better questions. to test our instruments, and to listen closely to the echo of older voices. My personal belief is that when we trace these echoes carefully, we gain not only knowledge about stellar motions, but also humility about the age and depth of human awareness. We realize that people walking under very different skies, speaking very different languages, were paying attention just as intensely as we are now, and sometimes even more. So the next time you see that tiny cluster on the shoulder of the bull, let it be more than a label in an astronomy app. Let it be a reminder that you are part of an unbroken line of sky watchers stretching back beyond written history. You are looking at the same little island of light that guided planting seasons, inspired harvest myths, and comforted travelers who had nothing but stars to steer by. You may count 6 points of light. You may strain to find a seventh. But either way, you are joining a very old conversation about presence and loss, about how patterns change while meaning persists. In that sense, Pleiades is not only a place in the sky, it is a mirror held up to our own longing to understand where we stand in the universe. And as we drift gently through space on this small world, perhaps the most calming thought is this: that even a handful of distant suns can teach us to look up, slow down, and remember that we are all reading the same silent story written in starlight. Have you ever looked up at the night sky, seen a tiny handful of stars clinging together like a small island of light, and wondered why that little patch seems to whisper louder than all the others? That soft knot of blue-white sparks is what we call the Pleiades Star Cluster. And for thousands of years, it has been less a group of suns and more a chorus of stories, myths, and quiet questions from the human heart. Astronomers describe it in simple terms as a young, open cluster of hot blue stars in the constellation Taurus, about 440 light-years away. Yet when you step outside on a crisp night and see it hanging on the shoulder of the celestial bull, it feels more like a tiny lantern pinned to the sky, guiding both farmers and dreamers through the dark seasons of the year. Pleiades lies near what the ancients imagined as the neck and shoulder of Taurus the bull, not by accident, but because human imagination saw a proud animal leaning into the heavens, its massive body drawn from brighter stars and its delicate shoulder marked by this little cluster. The bull charges across the zodiac, and just where its strength meets its vulnerability, there sits this fragile bouquet of light, like a garland placed over the shoulders of a powerful being. In the quiet language of constellations, this placement turns Pleiades into an ornament, a jewel that softens the wildness of Taurus, reminding us that even in the most forceful parts of nature there is a touch of grace. Modern astronomers might talk about right ascension and declination, mapping its position precisely on charts. But when you simply tilt your head back and find Orion's belt, then follow the line of stars toward a small shimmering clump near a V-shaped pattern in Taurus, you are performing the same sky reading as shepherds, sailors, and priests did long ago. One of the reasons Pleiades is so easy to recognize is that it gathers its brightness into a small space, like a campfire in the wilderness of the sky. Carl Sagan once reminded us that the cosmos is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And Pleiades is a perfect example. It is a little pocket of improbably beautiful order in the randomness of scattered stars. Our eyes are drawn to patterns, especially to small clusters framed by darkness. So even people who know very little about constellations often find themselves asking an astronomer friend what that little bunch of lights is. Imagine a child walking with a grandparent on a cold evening. the older hand pointing up with a slow patience, tracing lines from the belt of Orion to the red eye of Aldebaran in Taurus, then finally to that little nest of stars on the bull's shoulder. In that moment, the sky stops being an abstract dome and becomes a storybook. And Pleiades is one of the first words the child learns in the language of the universe. Yet there is a puzzle here that has haunted storytellers and scientists alike, and it lives inside a very simple question. If most people can only see 6 bright stars in Pleiades, why has it been called the Seven Sisters in so many cultures? Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to say that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And perhaps this little arithmetic problem is the cosmos nudging us to pay closer attention. In Greek myth, the 7 sisters are the daughters of Atlas and Pleione, pursued across the sky by the hunter Orion. One of the sisters, so the story goes, fell in love with a mortal man or faded from shame and hid herself, which is why we now see only 6 strong stars, while the 7th lingers faintly in the background. On the other side of the world, Aboriginal Australian traditions speak of a group of girls in the sky chased by a persistent male figure, with one girl separated or taken away, leaving 6 to shine more clearly. These are not faint, local coincidences. They are voices that have never met, telling nearly the same tale under entirely different horizons. Modern data from missions like Gaia suggest that in the distant past, one of the Pleiades stars called Pleione was farther from Atlas than it appears today, bright enough and separate enough that ancient eyes could distinguish it as a distinct point of light. Over tens of thousands of years, gravitational dances have brought their apparent positions closer together, so that to most human observers now the pair blends into a single glow, effectively hiding the 7th sister in plain sight. When you combine that with the fact that human eyesight varies wildly, with some people able to see 8 or even 9 stars in the cluster under perfect dark skies, you begin to understand how an astronomical evolution could turn into a myth of loss. Somewhere in our deep past, a hunter or a storyteller or a child noticed that a star which had always been counted was becoming harder to see. And because humans rarely let a mystery remain naked, they dressed it in narrative. The vanished sister cried, or loved, or fell, and the sky accepted the story as gently as it accepted the light. Think for a moment of a farmer in the ancient world, living without clocks or printed calendars, relying on the sky as the only reliable book of seasons. When Pleiades rose before dawn, it marked the time to prepare the fields. When it gleamed high at midnight, it signaled the approach of the darker half of the year. The cluster was not just a pretty ornament, it was a practical instrument, a cosmic bell that rang out silent warnings and promises about planting and harvest. If one of those familiar stars gradually faded from easy view, it might have felt as unsettling as losing a digit on a trusted clock, a reminder that even the firmest patterns in nature shift over time. From that unease, stories of the missing sister bloomed, offering emotional meaning where there had only been celestial mechanics. As a scientist, I am trained to talk about mass, temperature, spectral type, to say that these stars are young, only about 100 million years old, glowing blue because they burn hot and fast. I can explain how the dust around them scatters blue light, creating a reflection nebula that gives photographs of Pleiades that dreamy, misty veil. But, as a human being, I cannot ignore the way this tiny group of suns seems to gather not only gas and dust, but also memories, fears, and hopes from people who never met yet shared the same sky. When I stand outside with a telescope and invite strangers to look at Pleiades for the first time, there is often a small gasp. Not because the object is huge or spectacular, but because it feels intimate. Like peeking into a box of old family jewels and realizing they do not belong only to you. The lesson I draw from this cluster is a quiet one, but powerful. Pleiades shows us that science and story are not enemies, but two ways of holding the same light. The precise position of the cluster in the shoulder of Taurus, its role as one of the easiest star patterns to recognize, and the tension between 6 visible stars and the name 7 sisters all invite us to ask better questions, to test our instruments, and to listen closely to the echo of older voices. My personal belief is that when we trace these echoes carefully, we gain not only knowledge about stellar motions, but also humility about the age and depth of human awareness. We realize that people walking under very different skies, speaking very different languages, were paying attention just as intensely as we are now, and sometimes even more. So the next time you see that tiny cluster on the shoulder of the bull, let it be more than a label in an astronomy app. Let it be a reminder that you are part of an unbroken line of sky watchers stretching back beyond written history. You are looking at the same little island of light that guided planting seasons, inspired harvest myths, and comforted travelers who had nothing but stars to steer by. You may count 6 points of light. You may strain to find a 7th. But either way, you are joining a very old conversation about presence and loss, about how patterns change while meaning persists. In that sense, Pleiades is not only a place in the sky, it is a mirror held up to our own longing to understand where we stand in the universe. And as we drift gently through space on this small world, perhaps the most calming thought is this: that even a handful of distant suns can teach us to look up, slow down, and remember that we are all reading the same silent story written in starlight. Have you ever wondered why a tiny blur of blue stars could haunt the dreams of farmers, priests, and storytellers across the whole earth? On any clear night when Pleiades rises above the horizon, it looks so gentle. Just a small cluster resting on the shoulder of Taurus. Yet for ancient cultures, it was not just a pretty ornament in the sky. It was a signal fire lit in the heavens, a cosmic bell that rang at the turning of the year, a reminder that life and death of crops, herds, and sometimes of entire villages depended on knowing when those little stars would first return to the dawn or stand highest at midnight. Imagine a world without calendars, without clocks, without satellites telling you the weather for the next week. You wake before sunrise, the air still cold, your breath almost visible, and you look to the east to see whether the 7 sisters have come back to the sky. If they rise just before the sun, you know the season is turning. Rains will come or dry winds will return. Seeds must go into the ground now, or the chance will be lost. In that world, Pleiades was not an abstract constellation. It was a voice saying, plant now, harvest now, prepare now. It was a matter of survival. Across the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks watched Pleiades to mark the sailing and farming seasons. The poet Hesiod advised farmers to reap when the Pleiades rose and plow when they set. Far away in the Pacific, the Maori of Aotearoa looked for Matariki, their name for Pleiades. Its heliacal rising at winter dawn signaled the new year and a time of remembrance for the dead. In Japan, Subaru, the same cluster, announced seasonal rhythms so strongly that a modern car company still carries its image in its logo. When we see this repetition of meaning, we begin to taste the depth of the shared human response to those stars. What is striking is that many of these cultures had no contact with one another in any practical sense. Greek sailors did not meet Maori navigators in some global conference of star watchers. And yet both looked at the same knot of blue light and tied their lives to it. Anthropologists sometimes say this is simply convergent utility. The cluster rises at a useful time for agriculture and seafaring in many latitudes. So of course people would notice it. But I think there is also something quietly emotional here. Something that touches the heart before it reaches the intellect. Carl Sagan once remarked that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. When countless cultures felt compelled to name and honor the same fragile group of stars, perhaps that was the cosmos, recognizing one of its own patterns over and over again. Consider a simple scene from a village thousands of years ago. A child stands beside a parent at the edge of a field, the soil freshly turned, the air filled with the smell of earth and smoke. The parent lifts a hand and points to the little cluster rising in the twilight sky. "Those stars mean it is time to plant the grain," they say. "When the sisters climb higher and disappear again, we will know when to harvest." That child grows up, tells the same story to their own children, and the story travels farther than their feet ever will. Long before writing, the stars were the first books, and Pleiades was one of the first lines on the first page. Among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the cluster appears again as a group of young women pursued across the sky by Orion, the hunter figure. In Greece, the myth is uncannily similar. Again, 7 sisters chased by a male figure in the neighboring constellation. Many researchers point out how astonishing this parallel is given the immense separation in time and geography. Some suggest the story may be a memory carried by early humans as they migrated out of Africa, a tale so old that it predates most languages we know today. In this reading, Pleiades becomes not only a seasonal marker but a thread of narrative that ties together tens of thousands of years of human wandering. Neil deGrasse Tyson once said that when we look at the stars, we are not just observing the cosmos, we are also watching a long-running human conversation about meaning. Pleiades is one of the longest-running topics in that conversation. Why did people see this cluster as a sign of life and death for their crops and climate? Part of the answer lies in its brightness and position. Pleiades is young and hot. Its blue stars condensed from the same cloud of gas and dust that still wraps them like veils in deep photographs. It stands out even in light-polluted skies today. So in darker ancient skies it must have been almost painfully clear. Its heliacal rising often coincides with turning points in regional weather patterns, the onset of rains or storms or dry seasons. Over generations, families notice the pattern, then villages, then cultures. Soon the cluster is no longer just a convenient calendar mark. It becomes a trusted ally or a stern messenger. When it returns and the river does not swell, fear grows. Rituals are created. Offerings are made. The sky is stable enough to be reliable, but mysterious enough to demand respect. If we listen carefully, we can feel the emotional logic behind that respect. When a people live so close to the edge that one failed harvest means hunger or worse, they naturally look for any sign that offers advance warning. They weave stories around these signs to help remember them, to teach them to children, to pass them on in song and ceremony. So Pleiades becomes not just a cluster of stars, but a family of sisters, each with a personality, each representing a virtue or a danger. If one sister fades, perhaps that means caution. If they shine bright, perhaps that means abundance. We see this in myths where a lost or dim sister is associated with sorrow or transgression, a way to explain subtle changes in visibility that modern astronomers now attribute to stellar motion and human eyesight. As a modern scientist or science enthusiast, you might feel far removed from that ancient urgency. Today we have weather models and satellites, global supply chains and artificial light that drowns out the subtle hints of the sky. Yet there is still something deeply moving in the fact that when you step outside on a cold evening and notice Pleiades shining above the horizon, you are standing in the same line of sight as countless ancestors. Your retina and theirs are lit by the same photons that left those stars hundreds of years ago. In a quiet way, you are participating in the same act of noticing that kept your species alive long enough for you to exist. My own view is that the obsession of ancient cultures with Pleiades is not strange at all. It is a mirror that shows us how human it is to search the sky for patterns that help us navigate both the outer world and the inner one. On the surface, the cluster was a clock for planting and sailing, but beneath that it was also a reminder of cycles of loss and return, of light fading and then coming back. In this sense, Pleiades taught resilience, patience, and humility before forces bigger than any village or empire. When we forget that our lives are still bound to a delicate balance of climate and seasons, we risk repeating mistakes in a more technological but not necessarily wiser age. The lesson we can draw is simple yet profound. The sky is not just a backdrop for our stories. It is also an active teacher. Ancient people learned to listen to it through Pleiades, and that listening shaped myths, rituals, and even moral codes. Today we have the chance to unite that old way of listening with modern astronomy, to see the same cluster as both a scientifically young open star group and a spiritually ancient symbol of turning seasons. When you next notice Pleiades high above the horizon, you might take a slow breath, feel the weight of time stretching behind you, and ask yourself what story you are adding to this long chain. In that soft pause between heartbeats and starlight, science becomes a kind of meditation, and the Seven Sisters become not just objects of study but companions on the path of remembering who we are in the universe. How would you find your place in time if every clock vanished and every calendar burned away? If you woke in a world with no phones, no screens, no numbers on the wall, only the slow turning of the sky above your head. For our ancestors, this was not a thought experiment. It was daily reality. The night was their clock, the constellations their compass, and clusters like the Pleiades were as important as any temple or royal decree. Long before we measured seconds and minutes, humans watched the rising and setting of familiar star patterns and quietly learned that the heavens keep time with a patience no human hand could match. Imagine a small village on the edge of the ancient world. The air is cold enough that every breath turns to mist. Fields lie fallow after harvest, and the elders call the children outside in the deep hours before dawn. They do not show them a page in a book. They point to a cluster of blue-white sparks just above the dark shoulder of the bull in the sky, the Pleiades. This was their seasonal marker, their silent announcement that autumn had arrived in truth. Not just in the chill of the air but in the language of the cosmos itself. When the Pleiades rose at a certain hour of the night, it meant something very concrete. It was time to store grain more carefully, to prepare for shortages, to respect the fact that warmth and abundance were retreating. Without technology, how did they know day from day, month from month, season from season? At first, by simple noticing, the way any child might. The sun rose and set at different points along the horizon through the year. Shadows grew longer or shorter. At night, some constellations climbed high while others sank into absence. A careful mind could see that the sky was not random. It was a repeating pattern. Over generations, this noticing became knowledge, and that knowledge became culture. People gave names to the stars. They linked them into stories and myths. And those myths were memory devices, ways to remember when to plant barleys, when to follow the herds, when to expect storms from the sea. A modern physicist might describe this in dry terms as empirical observation of periodic celestial phenomena. Yet there is something more tender here, something human. Carl Sagan loved to remind us that our ancestors were skywatchers long before they were scholars, that entire civilizations rose on the simple practice of looking up and paying attention night after night. In that sense, astronomy began not as an elite science but as a shared act of survival, a village looking together at the same silent signs and agreeing on what they meant. Neil deGrasse Tyson has often said that when we look at the stars, we are also looking at our past. For early humans, that past was not abstract. It was last winter, the last famine, the last time the Pleiades climbed high and the rivers began to freeze. The Pleiades in particular held a special role because they are small, bright, and easy to recognize. They rise and set in a way that is perfectly timed to the turning of the year in many parts of Earth, especially in the northern hemisphere. When this star cluster first appears in the evening sky after being hidden in the glare of the sun for weeks, it is like the reappearance of an old friend who always shows up at the same moment in the story. To farmers, that reappearance could mean the end of planting and the beginning of waiting. To sailors, it could mark a dangerous season of storms. In many cultures, the autumn rising of the Pleiades became a kind of cosmic bell, ringing in a time of reckoning, a reminder that the generous months were closing and harsh winds were on their way. Consider a simple story to make this more vivid. Picture an ancient farmer whose father and grandfather have all told him the same thing. Do not trust only your skin and your hunger. Trust the sky. One year the summer is long and warm. Fruit hangs even later than usual. And the villagers begin to talk. Maybe this year winter will be gentle. The farmer looks up one evening and sees the Pleiades just lifting above the horizon at dusk, glittering like tiny shards of ice. He remembers the stories, how every time those blue fires returned to this spot in the pass sky, the cold arrived soon after. Instead of relaxing, he works harder, storing grain, drying meat, checking roofs. Weeks later, a sudden change in weather lashes the valley with wind and frost. His neighbors, who trusted only the sweetness of that long summer struggle, but his household endures. For his children, the lesson is obvious. The stars do not just decorate the sky, they warn us in advance. This is why so many autumn festivals hover around the time when the Pleiades are high at midnight. The Day of the Dead, harvest rites, fire ceremonies. They are not random dates scattered through the year. They often map onto the same celestial schedule, the moment when that tight little cluster of blue stars stands guard over the world. Some anthropologists argue that these festivals arose from agricultural necessity, a psychological way to face the fear of hunger and darkness. But there is also a quieter possibility, that humans instinctively felt the poetry of this timing, that when nature dimmed the lights, they answered with stories, candles, and songs for the dead. From a scientific perspective, using stars as a calendar makes perfect sense. The Earth orbits the Sun in a steady rhythm, and so the backdrop of constellations behind the Sun appears to shift slowly through the year. Because that pattern repeats almost exactly, year after year, specific stellar events become reliable time markers, like dates printed in the sky. Modern astronomers still rely on that precision when they speak of sidereal time, right ascension, and declination. In that way, the trained eye of an ancient shepherd following the Pleiades across the night was doing the same fundamental thing that a modern observatory does, reading the clockwork of the cosmos. Yet I think there is a deeper layer that numbers alone cannot capture. When I imagine those early watchers standing under the cold sky, I do not just see practical people memorizing patterns. I see a kind of quiet reverence. To align your life with the stars is to admit that you are not the center of the story, that your harvest, your hunger, your joy and your grief all unfold inside a larger rhythm. That awareness can be frightening, but it is also strangely comforting. As the physicist Brian Cox likes to say, the same laws that govern the dance of galaxies also govern the beating of our hearts. For ancient people, watching the Pleiades return each year may have felt like a promise. Seasons change, kings rise and fall, but the sky keeps its appointments. Today, we live wrapped in artificial light, with digital calendars that buzz in our pockets and tell us where to be and when. We do not need the Pleiades to warn us that winter is coming. Weather apps will do that for us days in advance. Yet in trading the sky for the screen, we may have lost something subtle, a sense of participation in the wider fabric of the universe. A feeling that our days and nights are woven into a pattern older than history. My own view is that looking up is still one of the most radical acts available to us. Not because the stars will tell us exactly what to do, but because they remind us that our lives are chapters in a much longer book. A lesson I draw from the old practice of reading time in the stars is twofold. On one level, it is a story of human intelligence, of how careful observation and patient memory can build a working model of reality without any machines at all. On another level, it is an invitation to humility and connection, to remember that every schedule we make rests on the turning of a planet beneath a sky that does not need us. When the Pleiades rise on an autumn evening now, most people pass beneath them without knowing. But you do not have to. You can step outside, find that little cluster above the shoulder of Taurus, and feel for a moment the same mixture of awe and caution that your ancestors felt. A bittersweet awareness that beautiful things in the sky can also be warnings of hard days to come. And as you stand there, breathing slowly beneath that ancient light, the universe becomes a little more intimate, not just a backdrop, but a gentle teacher. The Pleiades still keep time, still whisper of changing seasons, still invite us to live in rhythm with something larger than ourselves. In listening to them, we are not returning to superstition. We are returning to attention, to the simple, quiet art of looking up and letting the sky remind us where we are in the long unfolding of time. Why would a small cluster of blue stars in the shoulder of Taurus be tied to festivals of death all over the world? Why should the laughter of Halloween crowds, the candles of European vigils for the dead, and the solemn rites of ancient Egypt all quietly bow to the same point in the sky? On the surface, it sounds like coincidence, a pattern our storytelling minds are eager to see. Yet when we follow the trail of the Pleiades through history, the line between astronomy and myth begins to blur in a strangely persuasive way. Long before written calendars, the sky was the only clock we had. The Pleiades were not just pretty lights. They were signals, warnings, promises. In the northern hemisphere, when this cluster rose into the autumn night and climbed toward its highest point at midnight, it whispered the same message year after year. The season of warmth is ending. The season of darkness is here. For communities whose survival depended on harvests and stored grain, that was not a poetic idea. It was a matter of life and death. It is no accident that so many cultures chose this turning point as the moment to speak with their dead. As one historian of religion wrote in words that stay with me, when light retreats and cold advances, people instinctively feel the presence of those who have gone before them more intensely. The sky mirrors that feeling, and the Pleiades are one of its clearest markers. Consider Halloween, born from the Celtic festival of Samhain, a night when the veil between the living and the dead was believed to grow thin. Some scholars have suggested that Samhain was fixed not just by the progress of the sun through the year, but also by the behavior of the Pleiades above the horizon, reaching their commanding height around midnight in late autumn. Imagine a priest standing on a windy hill thousands of years ago. No electric lights, no digital clocks, only the breath of the land and the slow movement of stars. He watches the small cluster rise, climb, and at the moment it stands highest in the south, he declares that the season of the dead has begun. In Central America, far from the Atlantic mists of the Celts, the Aztec world had its own festival for the dead, rituals that would later echo in the modern Day of the Dead. Again, some researchers have pointed out that these ceremonies were timed near the days when the Pleiades culminated at midnight. To those priests and astronomer sages, the Pleiades were like a swinging door in the heavens, a sign that one yearly world was closing and another was opening. The details of sacrifice and celebration differed. Masks and marigolds here, bonfires and carved turnips there. Yet the cosmic cue overhead may have been the same. Even in Egypt, where the great cycles of the Nile and the heliacal rising of Sirius ruled the ritual year, there are hints that other star groups, including the Pleiades, contributed to the sense of sacred timing around death and rebirth. The Egyptian philosopher of the modern era, taking stock of these patterns, might say that ancient people did not merely look at the sky, they lived inside a dialogue with it. And in that dialogue, the Pleiades spoke at the threshold between life and death. For a more concrete glimpse, picture a small village in late October 1,000 years ago. The last sheaves of grain are stacked in low golden mounds. The breath of animals steams in the night air. Smoke curls up from hearth fires. Children watch as elders light a single flame and carry it out into the dark fields. They stop, look up, and there it is. That tiny cluster etched against the black. The elder explains that when those stars stand high above at midnight, the souls of kin are nearest. So food is laid out. Stories are told. And the dead are invited to share the warmth one more time. In this way, a simple astronomical event becomes a thread tying generations together. Modern astrophysicists view the same cluster with very different instruments. Through precise measurements, we know the Pleiades are young hot blue stars embedded in a drifting veil of Parsa dust, around 440 light-years away. Yet even among scientists you can feel the echo of the ancient awe. Carl Sagan once reminded us that the cosmos is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. That strangeness includes the way a physical configuration of stars can shape the emotional and spiritual rhythm of entire civilizations. Astronomers like R.G. Halliburton in the 19th century took this idea seriously, arguing that the near-universal timing of festivals of the dead could not be explained by any shared, written calendar, but might instead point back to a common stellar reference point. To them, the Pleiades at midnight were the hidden metronome behind human ritual. Of course, we do not have to accept every bold claim uncritically. It is entirely possible that some of these alignments are coincidental, or that practical agricultural concerns and solar cycles were more important than a single little cluster in Taurus. As a scientist, I feel the pull of skepticism, the need to ask whether we are building a pattern out of selective examples. But as a storyteller who loves the night sky, I also sense that the human mind is doing something profound when it links the fading of warmth, the fear of winter, and the remembrance of the dead with a recurring pattern in the stars. That instinct to weave meaning between earth and sky may be one of our oldest technologies. There is also a psychological dimension that gives this link a quiet plausibility. When days grow shorter and the land turns cold, we are naturally drawn inward, into memory, into questions about our own finite lives. To stand beneath the autumn sky and see the Pleiades riding high at midnight is to be reminded that countless generations before us have faced the same darkness and survived by turning it into story. One modern anthropologist put it gently, saying that the dead remain part of a community for as long as the living remember and speak their names. If the Pleiades helped mark the night for that remembrance, then we might think of them as a kind of celestial bell, ringing once a year to call both the living and the dead together. My own view is that whether or not every Festival of the Dead was literally timed to the midnight culmination of the Pleiades, the deeper truth lies in the pattern of attention itself. Humans everywhere watched the sky with an intensity that we can hardly imagine today, and certain star groups became emotional anchors in that watchfulness. The Pleiades seem to have been one of those anchors, not only marking seasonal change, but also offering a visual symbol for a cluster of souls journeying together through the dark. There is a quiet lesson in that image. We too travel, as a small, fragile cluster, through a vast unknown. And the way we care for our dead says a great deal about how we understand our place in the universe. Perhaps the real gift of noticing this connection between the Pleiades and festivals of death is not to prove a grand astronomical theory, but to remember that for most of our history, we did not see the cosmos as a cold backdrop. We saw it as a partner in our own story. When you look up on an autumn night and find that tiny spray of blue light, you are not just seeing distant suns. You are touching a long line of human beings who stood where you stand, felt the same chill in the air, and chose to answer their fear of death with candles, costumes, songs, and prayers. In that sense, the hidden history of the Pleiades is really the hidden history of us, our need to find meaning at the edge of the dark. What if the survival of entire civilizations once depended on a small cluster of blue stars rising quietly in the autumn sky? What if that gentle shimmer was not just decoration above our heads, but a cosmic clock that told our ancestors when to sow grain and when to brace for hunger? When we speak of the Pleiades, the seven sisters, we are not only naming a pretty patch of light, we are touching a meeting point between myth and agriculture, between ritual and survival. Carl Sagan used to remind us that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And the story of the Pleiades is one of the clearest ways in which the cosmos once whispered practical instructions to the fragile minds and bodies that depended on the soil. Imagine a community thousands of years ago. No phones. No printed calendars. Only seasons that could bless with harvest or punish with famine. Night after night, elders watch the sky, noticing which stars rise just before dawn, which ones sit overhead at midnight. Over time, they begin to see a pattern. A faint clump of blue-white stars appears at a certain moment in the year, just as the air cools and the winds change, and the animals move differently across the land. They give it names, weave it into songs, tell children that when the seven sisters return to the night, the time of planting has come or gone, depending on the land they stand upon. The Pleiades become not only a story but a schedule, a celestial bell that rings once a year in the minds of those who know how to listen. In many parts of the world, the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, the moment they first appear in the dawn sky after being hidden in the sun's glare, was a sacred sign for farmers around the Mediterranean, for island navigators in the Pacific, for herders on the high plateaus of the Andes. This rising was a message from the sky about timing, about when the earth was ready to receive seed or when storms were on their way. The Greek poet Hesiod spoke of the Pleiades guiding the sowing and the harvesting, while much later, the astronomer E.C. Krupp would call ancient skywatchers sophisticated observers who turned the heavens into a calendar long before they had written numbers. The cluster itself is small, but the pattern it kept was vast. Picture a single year in a small farming village. The previous harvest was lean. The grain jars are half empty, and the children's faces are a little thinner than usual. The people gather around their elders as the dry season stretches on, waiting for the one sign they trust more than anything written on bark or bone. In the chill hours before sunrise, they climb a low hill, breath steaming in the dark, and their eyes search the place where night and morning meet. Then at last, just above the horizon, the tiny cluster flickers into view. A murmur runs through the group, fear and relief mixing together, because they know what this means. The long memory of the village says that when the Pleiades rise here and now, the rains will soon follow, and the planting must not be delayed. Their decision to scratch seeds into the reluctant soil is not guesswork. It is an act of faith anchored to a pattern in the stars. For tens of thousands of years, before mechanical clocks and digital timestamps, the sky was the only reliable library of cycles we had. The Pleiades move with the spinning earth, rising earlier each night, arriving at different hours in different seasons. To a mind trained by repetition, this movement becomes as clear as the ticking of a watch. You and I might glance up and see only scattered points of light. But a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia or a navigator in Polynesia could read that pattern the way we read a calendar app. Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to say that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us. And yet in this case it did. It offered a simple repeating configuration of stars, that lined up with the needs of seeds, rivers, and monsoons. When we call the Pleiades a celestial clock, we are recognizing the way human consciousness wrapped itself around that repeating pattern. A clock is not only gears and hands. It is a shared agreement that when the pointer reaches a certain mark, we act. The Pleiades were that pointer in the sky, and entire cultures agreed that when the sisters rose at dawn or stood at the top of the midnight sky, certain tasks must begin or end. The clock never ticked aloud, and yet it set the rhythm of plows, festivals, and even funerals. In Mesoamerica, for example, some ceremonies of renewal were timed to the passage of this cluster, with fires extinguished and rekindled as if the year itself could be reborn along with the pattern above. There is something quietly moving about the idea that our ancestors entrusted their survival not to written contracts, but to a shared relationship with the sky. Today we speak of data and models, and these are powerful, but behind them lies the same desire to find a reliable signal in the noise of nature. The Pleiades were an early signal, bright enough to see with the naked eye, regular enough to predict, and beautiful enough to remember in stories. Perhaps this is why so many cultures not only measured them but personified them, turning the cluster into sisters, daughters, maidens pursued across the heavens. Myth takes the cold precision of astronomy and warms it with human feeling, making the pattern emotionally sticky, harder to forget. From a scientific point of view, there is nothing particularly unique about this cluster compared to countless others scattered through the Milky Way. It is young, bright, and wrapped in a web of dust that reflects their blue light. But the laws that shaped it are universal. Yet I would argue that what makes the Pleiades special is not only their physical nature, it is their role in our story. They mark a bridge between simple skywatching and systemic timekeeping, between random stargazing and organized agriculture. When you domesticate plants and animals, you also domesticate time, and the Pleiades were among the first markers we used to tame that flow. In this sense, the birth of stable villages, grain surplus, and eventually cities and written history is tied in a subtle way to the repeated rising of a small cluster of stars in the eastern sky. One of the quiet lessons hidden here is humility. We often imagine ourselves as modern, standing at the end point of progress, looking back at a long line of ignorant ancestors. But those ancestors were capable of noticing a faint pattern that required patience across many lifetimes. They turned that pattern into a tool for survival, and then wrapped that tool in song and ritual so it would not be lost. To me, this is a form of wisdom, a reminder that intelligence is not only in equations, but in the ability to live in rhythm with a world that does not explain itself in words. Another lesson is connection. The same cluster that rose above the fields of ancient Greece also shone above the canoes of Pacific navigators and the deserts of Australia. Light from those stars fell on eyes that never knew each other, yet all of them found meaning there. When I think about this, I feel that the Pleiades are a kind of shared heartbeat of humanity, a soft blue pulse that has synchronized rituals, harvests, and hopes across continents and ages. In a world that now feels fragmented, it is soothing to remember that we once looked to the same small patch of sky to decide when to plant food for our children. On a more personal level, when I step outside on a clear night and search for that tiny cluster, I try to slow my thoughts until they match the old rhythm of the earth turning. I imagine all those who came before, standing in silence, reading the same sign. The Pleiades become a breathing exercise for the soul, an invitation to step out of the frantic ticking of digital clocks and feel a deeper measure of time. In that quiet, science and poetry stop arguing and begin to cooperate, because both are simply ways of paying attention. So when we ask how the Pleiades influenced human civilization, the answer is both simple and profound. They helped keep people alive. They guided the sowing of seeds and the timing of rituals. But they also shaped our imagination of order in the universe. They showed us that the sky is not chaos, but a place where cycles can be trusted and meaning can be found. And as we sit here now, with satellites and atomic clocks, the old star clock still turns silently above us, inviting us to remember that our story has always been written in two places at once: in the soil beneath our feet and in the small cluster of blue fire that rises faithfully in the dark. What if one of the oldest, unsolved mysteries in human history is not hidden in a temple or a buried city, but in a tiny patch of stars that almost anyone can see with the naked eye? High above our heads, in the soft shimmer of the Pleiades, there is a question that refuses to fade. Why do so many cultures, separated by oceans and by ages, speak of 7 sisters when most of us can clearly count only 6? Why does Europe whisper of a lost star? Why do Africa, Asia, the Americas and the ancient peoples of Australia all carry some version of the same strange story? And could it be that what we call myth is in fact the echo of something real that happened in the sky long before any written word existed? When you stand beneath a clear night and look toward Taurus, you find this little cluster perched on the shoulder of the celestial bull, tiny compared to Orion or the Milky Way, yet bright enough to pull at your attention like a memory you cannot quite place. The Greeks called them the 7 daughters of Atlas, pursued by the hunter Orion until Zeus placed them in the sky for their protection. But in many tellings, only 6 remain clearly visible, because one sister fell in love with a mortal, or turned away in shame, or faded from grief. Indigenous Australians, in stories that may stretch back tens of thousands of years, speak of 7 young women chased by a group of men represented by the same row of stars we call Orion. In some versions, one of the girls is caught or hides or falls from the sky, leaving 6 shining points and one that is lost to ordinary sight. Native American traditions, from the Pacific Northwest to the plains, tell again of 7 youths or sisters or dancers who become stars, with one of them dimmed or hidden for a reason that changes from tribe to tribe but always circles the same core image. For a scientist, this repetition is deeply intriguing. Joseph Campbell once noted that myths are not lies, but metaphors for things that once mattered very much to the people who told them. Carl Sagan reminded us that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And here the cosmos seems to be telling the same story through many different human voices. How could peoples with no contact, no shared books, no common priesthood, end up describing the Pleiades with the same cast of characters and the same missing role? One possibility is that this is simply how the human mind works. We like 7s. We like families. We like the drama of one who goes astray. But there is another possibility, more fragile, more astonishing, that the sky itself has changed just enough in the deep past to leave a scar not only on star maps but on our collective imagination. Modern measurements from missions like Gaia show that 2 of the stars in the cluster, Atlas and Pleione are so close together today that to most eyes they blend into one. Wind the cosmic clock back tens of thousands of years, and calculations suggest that Pleione would have stood a little farther apart, bright enough to be recognized as a distinct star by watchers with no telescopes. Imagine generation after generation of sky watchers in Africa, in the Near East, in the first great migrations into Asia and Australia, counting 7 points of light in this tight little cluster that rises and sets with the seasons. They learn its pattern like we learn the shape of our own hands. They encode it into stories to teach their children when to plant, when to travel, when the cold will bite again. And then, very slowly, over stretches of time longer than any single life, one of those points sinks in brightness, sinking back toward the glare of its neighbor until most people can no longer see it as separate. What would that feel like? In a world where the sky is your calendar, your compass, your sacred text. You go out one crisp night and the 7 sisters are 6, or seem so. You ask elders, who insist there were once 7, and perhaps they tell you of a time when the missing one fell through carelessness, or betrayed a vow, or chose a human lover over the safety of the sky. Story becomes explanation. Explanation becomes ritual. Ritual becomes heritage. Then people move on, carrying that heritage with them over land bridges, along coasts, in canoes between islands. They lose contact with one another. Their languages fracture. Their pantheons diverge. Yet the core pattern remains. 6 shining, 1 lost. It is as if the human species shares a dream it once had beside ancient fires under a darker, quieter sky. To make this more tangible, imagine a small camp of hunter-gatherers on a plateau in what is now Africa. Night is cool. The air smells of dust and wood smoke. Above them the Milky Way arches like a river of crushed stone, bright enough to cast the faintest shadows. A child tugs at the hand of an elder, pointing up. The child has been taught to count the stars of the Pleiades as a test of sharp eyes and growing responsibility. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 7th is harder tonight, swimming in the glare of another, refusing to stand alone. The elder frowns, remembering a youth when that 7th spark seemed clearer, and tells a story to make sense of the change. A sister who hid her light, a girl who stumbled, a star who chose to leave. That story is told again and again, until it becomes inseparable from the stars themselves. As a modern listener, you might be tempted to dismiss all of this as coincidence or romantic overinterpretation. Yet anyone who has watched human memory at work knows how fiercely we hold on to patterns that once protected us, and how far we can carry them. My own view is that the myth of the lost star is likely a weaving of both threads: the universal human love for stories of loss and redemption, and a faint but real echo of astronomical change. I find it deeply moving that when astronomers plot stellar motions in cold numbers, their results appear to rhyme with whispers from the oldest storytellers we can imagine. It is as though the universe first carved its narrative into the arrangement of burning suns, and then invited us to retell that narrative in our own fragile language. In a more practical sense, the missing 7th star reminds us how dependent our ancestors were on paying attention. They did not have satellites or atomic clocks, but they had the patience to notice when a familiar pattern changed by a fraction. That patience kept them alive, guiding migrations, harvests, and the timing of ceremonies that bound communities together. Today, we rarely look up for more than a moment, our nights dimmed by city light and lit screens. Yet the same cluster is still there, drifting through the same seasons, asking the same question. How many do you see? And what story will you tell about them? There is also a gentle lesson about humility here. When we compare myths from different continents and realize they echo one another, we are reminded that our divisions are recent and often superficial. Long before there were nations or doctrines, there were simply humans, small, vulnerable, fascinated by the same cluster of blue-white stars. The Pleiades were a meeting place in the sky, a point of shared reference that no group could fence off or fully possess. In an age of noise and argument, it is strangely comforting to know that somewhere deep in our common past, we all stared at the same faint seventh light and wondered. As you listen to this, maybe lying back in the dark with your eyes closed, let the image settle in your mind. 6 bright sisters, one withdrawn, all of them sailing slowly through space together like a tiny fleet of lanterns on a black ocean. Remember that every time this story is told, whether by a Greek poet or an Aboriginal elder or a modern astronomer with a quiet voice, it keeps alive a connection between the precision of science and the tenderness of human feeling. The mystery of the missing seventh star may never have a final, official answer, but perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps its true gift is to invite us to pay attention again, to the sky, to each other, and to the stories we inherit and choose to pass on. In that sense, the lost sister is not truly lost at all. She is living quietly in our questions, in our myths, and in the gentle decision to look up just a little longer before we fall asleep. Have you ever wondered why 2 cultures separated by oceans and tens of millennia tell almost the same story about a handful of tiny blue stars in the night sky and a hunter who will not stop chasing them? When the lights of the city fade, and the sky finally remembers how to be dark again, the Pleiades rise like a soft cluster of diamonds above the horizon, and nearby the long belt of Orion cuts through the night like an arrow of light. In ancient Greece, storytellers said those 7 gentle stars were the daughters of Atlas, fleeing from the desire of the hunter Orion, and in the end, Zeus placed them in the sky to protect them. On the other side of the world, among Australian Aboriginal peoples whose traditions reach back into the deep time of humanity, elders also look up and see a group of young women clustered together, and a relentless male figure pursuing them across the sky night after night. How is it that 2 cultures who did not share ships, alphabet, or maps could share a story so precise that even the arrangement of stars in the sky matches the roles of the characters they describe? Astronomers and anthropologists have begun to pay very close attention to this eerie resonance between mythologies. When we listen carefully to elders of Aboriginal communities, we hear narratives that are not just charming folktales but detailed sky lore, anchored to the rising and setting times of specific stars. Researchers like Duane Hamaka and Ray Norris have argued that these stories can preserve observational knowledge for tens of thousands of years, carried forward by memory instead of ink. In Greece, poets and mythmakers wrapped their sky knowledge in the language of gods and heroes, but they were doing something very similar, encoding the movements of stars into drama and emotion so that people would remember. The Pleiades rise in the autumn sky of the northern hemisphere, announcing the coming of winter, storms, and the time to harvest and prepare. For many Aboriginal groups, the cluster also marks seasonal cycles, the appearance of certain foods, the time of ceremonial gatherings. Myth becomes a kind of living calendar, and the hunter chasing the 7 girls is not only a story of desire, but a reminder of when to plant, when to travel, when to be careful. From the perspective of a scientist, this convergence is fascinating because the sky is the same for everyone. Carl Sagan once said, in one of his most famous lines, that we are star stuff becoming aware of itself. In this case, star stuff is also telling stories about itself, and somehow those stories rhyme across continents. The hunter Orion is not just a human figure. He is a pattern of bright stars that naturally suggests a strong body, shoulders, belt, and weapon. The Pleiades are not a random scatter. They are tight, delicate, shimmering, and to many human eyes they feel feminine or youthful. It is almost as if the sky itself encourages certain narratives, whispering to any culture that will look up long enough. Here is a protector. Here are the vulnerable ones. Here is the endless chase that marks the turning of the seasons. Yet the similarity runs even deeper than that. In both Greek and Aboriginal traditions, there is often mention of a missing sister, a star that should be visible but is somehow lost. Modern measurements from the Gaia Space Observatory suggest that in the distant past, one of the Pleiades stars was separated more clearly from its neighbors, appearing as an obvious 7th point of light, whereas today it blends closely with another and is hard to see with the naked eye. If that is true, then very ancient humans could have looked up and truly seen 7 bright sisters. And later generations watched one of them grow fainter until she seemed to vanish. Imagine the impact of that on cultures for whom the sky was not background decoration but the central text of existence. To wake up one season and realize that one of the guides you trusted has disappeared, that a familiar light no longer stands where it always stood. The easiest way to keep such a shock in memory is to turn it into a story about a sister who hides, who is taken, who falls from the sky. If we slow down and inhabit the lives of people long before telescopes, without calendars, without digital clocks, we begin to understand why these myths are more than superstition. Night after night, the sky was the greatest cinema available, and everyone knew the script by heart. The rising of Orion in the east could signal the beginning of a hunting season or the migration of animals. The disappearance of the Pleiades into the glare of the sun could mark a dangerous time of heat or storm. Aboriginal elders describe the 7 sisters hiding from a pursuer who attempts to steal them as wives. And when those stars sink below the horizon, it is as if the women have hidden themselves behind the curve of the earth. In Greek tales, the story is cast in the language of gods and transformation, but the pattern is the same. The sky becomes a stage where cosmic motion is translated into human relationships, love and fear, pursuit and escape. For a modern listener, especially someone who loves science, it can be tempting to treat all this as coincidence or charming metaphor and nothing more. Yet as more researchers take indigenous knowledge seriously, a different picture emerges. These stories may be carrying genuine astronomical information encoded in narrative form, like data stored in a song. Astrophysicist Avi Loeb once remarked that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us. And yet humans have always tried to make sense of it anyway, often by turning raw observation into mythic structure. When we see the same structure arise independently in separate cultures, we are probably looking at something deeper than a lucky overlap. We might be seeing one of the ways the human brain naturally organizes the cosmos, weaving meaning between the stars and our own lives. Consider a simple scene that could have happened 50,000 years ago, long before recorded history. A small group of humans gathers around a fire at the edge of a savanna or a desert. The night enormous above them. One of the elders extends a hand and traces the belt of Orion with a finger, explaining to the children that this is a mighty hunter, a figure who never gives up. Then the elder points to the cluster of 7 bright points nearby, telling how they are sisters walking together, watching over one another. The story that follows is half warning and half comfort, a reminder of danger and a promise of protection. Those children grow up, carry the tale with them as their people move across continents, and their descendants will repeat the same gestures under different skies. At some point, what we now call Greek culture receives the story and reshapes the names. While in Australia, another branch of the human family shapes it in their own language. But the backbone of the narrative remains the same: the hunter, the sisters, the endless chase across the dome of the world. As a science communicator, I find this deeply moving. We often talk about data and theories, about spectral lines and parallax measurements, about the Gaia mission and high-precision astrometry. All of that is crucial. It lets us measure how the stars of the Pleiades are actually moving, and reconstruct what the cluster looked like long before any written language existed. But the human response to those findings is just as important, because it reminds us that science does not float above culture. It grows out of our very old habit of staring at the sky and asking why. When we see that Greek myth and Aboriginal tradition both remembered a lost 7th star, and modern satellite data suggests there really was a more separated star long ago, we feel a sudden bridge between hard measurement and soft memory. It is as if the universe is saying, yes, your stories were paying attention. Many thinkers have reflected on the power of such stories. The physicist and writer David Bohm spoke about the universe as an undivided wholeness in flowing movement. And on nights like this, when Orion lifts his glittering shoulders above the horizon and the Pleiades sparkle ahead of him, it is easy to feel that wholeness. Cultures that never met still participate in the same cosmic choreography, like dancers who have learned the same steps from the same silent music. The lesson here is one of humility and connection. Humility, because we see how small we are compared to the deep sky. And connection, because we realize that across time and distance humans have been having the same conversation with the stars. There is also a quieter personal lesson buried in all this. The hunter and the 7 sisters do not only live in the constellations, they live inside us as patterns of pursuit and protection, fear and courage. Every one of us has chased something that kept slipping out of reach, and every one of us has tried to stay together with the people we love in the face of danger. When we look up and see Orion following the Pleiades across the sky, we are seeing a reflection of very human struggles, frozen in light that left those stars hundreds of years ago. If different cultures told similar stories about them, perhaps it is because the underlying emotions are universal, shared by shepherds in the Mediterranean and hunters in the Australian desert alike. So what do we take away from this surprising harmony between Greek and Aboriginal myth? At one level, It is a reminder that oral traditions can preserve detailed observations of the natural world for unimaginable spans of time. At another level, it suggests that when humans look up at the same sky, we are drawn towards similar meanings, not because we copy each other, but because both our brains and the stars follow patterns that invite connection. And at the deepest level, it invites us to see science and story not as enemies, but as companions walking side by side, like seven sisters on a long journey through the dark. When we lie back, breathe slowly, and let the night wash over us, the cosmos stops being an abstraction and becomes a presence again, something we are inside of rather than outside looking at. In that stillness, the old tales of Orion and the Seven Sisters feel less like distant myths and more like messages from our ancestors, reminding us that we have always been children of the same sky. What if the oldest story humanity ever told did not begin around a campfire, but in the soft blue light of a tiny cluster of stars hanging over our heads? Imagine a night tens of thousands of years ago, long before cities, long before writing, when our ancestors stood on the African plains and looked up at the same sky we see today. Among the countless lights, there was one small cluster that drew the eye again and again. 7 bright sparks nestled together, like children huddling for warmth. Today we call it the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters. And some astronomers suggest that the myths about this little group may be 70,000 to 100,000 years old. Older than any temple. Older than any known legend. As the mythologist Joseph Campbell once remarked in Spirit, myths are public dreams. And here we may be touching the earliest dream our species ever shared. Modern science offers a quiet support for this possibility. Not as a certainty, but as a tantalizing clue. The Gaia Space Observatory has mapped the motions of the stars in this cluster in exquisite detail, allowing astronomers to roll back the cosmic clock in their calculations. When they do that for the star we now call Pleione, they find that tens of thousands of years ago, it sat farther from its neighbor Atlas, bright enough to stand out clearly as a separate light to the naked eye. If you and I had been there, on some ancient savannah night, we would not have seen 6 main stars as we do now, but 7. Carl Sagan once said that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And here the cosmos might be knowing itself across 100 millennia through a single disappearing point of light. Now think about the stories. In ancient Greece, people spoke of 7 daughters of Atlas chased by Orion, one sister hiding her face in shame, which is why only 6 could be seen. Among Aboriginal peoples of Australia, whose ancestors left Africa perhaps 70,000 years ago, there is a strikingly similar tale. A group of young women in the sky pursued by a hunter. One girl taken or lost, leaving 6. These cultures did not share books. They did not share ships or trade routes in the modern sense. Yet they share a pattern so specific that many researchers have paused and wondered whether the root of the story reaches back to a time before our ancestors parted ways, when the Pleiades truly shone as 7 bright sisters in the sky. Imagine a small group of families gathered around a fire somewhere in prehistoric Africa. The night is cool. The fire is low. And above them the Pleiades have just risen in the east. An elder lifts a hand and points, not only to mark a time of year when certain fruits ripen or certain animals migrate, but also to tell a story. 7 sisters, or 7 birds, or 7 sparks from the hearth of the gods. The exact form does not matter. What matters is that children listen, remember, and pass the tale on. When those children grow and move with their people across deserts and coasts, some heading toward Europe, some toward Asia, some on journeys that will ultimately lead to Australia and the far Pacific, they carry that little cluster in their minds like an invisible amulet. Tens of thousands of years later, the languages have changed, the gods have changed, the clothes and tools, and fears and hopes of human beings have changed. Yet when the Pleiades rise before dawn at certain times of year, people still whisper stories of 7 beings in the sky and of one that is missing. The historian of religion Mircea Eliade suggested that sacred stories stretch a bridge between the ordinary present and an ancient time of origins, a time when the world was first ordered. If the Pleiades legend truly began on African nights so remote that ice sheets still covered much of the northern world, then every time a farmer in Greece, or a storyteller in Japan, or a singer in the Australian desert spoke of those 7 stars, they were unconsciously walking back across that bridge toward the shared childhood of our species. From a scientific perspective, caution is always required. No serious astronomer or anthropologist will claim with absolute certainty that this is the oldest story humanity has, or that we can date a myth with the precision we assign to a rock or a fossil. The Gaia measurements show how the stars move. Comparative mythology shows how similar tales echo around the world. Genetics and archaeology trace the paths of early human migrations out of Africa. When we place these lines of evidence side by side, a picture begins to form. Not a photograph, but a painting in soft strokes. In that painting, Pleiades is not just a pretty cluster of blue stars. It is a kind of time capsule, a sky-born archive that lets us glimpse how our ancestors once looked up and made sense of the night. Let us bring this down to a very human scale. Picture a child today, standing in a backyard somewhere in the 2020s, looking up on a clear winter evening. A parent points to a hazy knot of light near Taurus and says, "That is the Pleiades." Some call them the 7 sisters. Maybe the child hears a short story about a lost sister, or about a car company that put those stars in its logo, or about how sailors once used them to know when to travel. The moment is simple, domestic. Yet, it is also the latest link in a chain that may stretch back almost to the dawn of our species. The same gesture of pointing, the same cluster in the same patch of sky, the same impulse to fill the silence of the dark with meaning. For me, this is where the story of the Pleiades becomes more than an interesting scientific puzzle. It becomes a mirror, not just of the early sky, but of our own minds. If a tale about 7 stars can survive migrations, climate shifts, the rise and fall of empires, and still whisper in so many languages today, then memory itself is far deeper and more resilient than we usually imagine. We like to think that history begins with writing, with neat lines of script on clay or paper. Yet the Pleiades suggest that history can be sung, danced, pointed at in the sky, and carried only in stories, and still endure for tens of thousands of years. There is also a quiet lesson about humility. We often act as if the modern world is the peak of human understanding, as if people who lived before cities were wandering in mental darkness. But the care with which our ancestors watched the stars, the way they noticed the slow closing of Pleione toward Atlas, the way they wove that change into their shared imagination, suggests a level of attention and patience that many of us have lost. As physicist Brian Cox likes to remind audiences in his own way, the universe is old and we are young. And yet we carry within us the capacity to remember and to wonder across immense spans of time. The Pleiades story invites us to reclaim that capacity, to be both scientifically curious and deeply reverent at once. So what do we take with us when we step away from the telescope or turn off the screen for the night? Perhaps this: that every time you see that tiny cluster rising above the horizon, you are not just looking at a pretty ornament scattered on the velvet of the sky. You are looking at a meeting point between astrophysics and ancestry, between data and dream. You are looking at a question that has traveled with us since we first walked upright across the African grasslands. A question about who we are, where we come from, and how long our stories can truly last. Maybe the tale of the Pleiades is the oldest story we know, or maybe there are others waiting to be rediscovered. But as long as those faint blue sisters keep shining, the door back into that deep human past will never be fully closed. And when we ask how Pleiades helps us trace the history of our kind, the answer may be as simple and as profound as this: it teaches us that to remember the sky is to remember ourselves. What if one tiny change in the night sky, a single faint star slowly slipping into the glow of its brighter neighbor, could echo through 100,000 years of human stories? When astronomers used the Gaia Space Telescope to trace the motions of the stars in the Pleiades, they discovered something quietly astonishing. Pleione, a hot blue star that orbits close to Atlas, has not always appeared as it does to us tonight. Today, to the naked eye, Pleione and Atlas blur into a single point of light, an apparently ordinary star in a tiny cluster that many people mistake for a smudge or a passing airplane. But if we could turn back the cosmic clock to the deep past, to the time when the first fully modern humans were beginning their long journey out of Africa, Pleione would stand apart from Atlas, clearly visible as its own star, lifting the number of bright Pleiades from 6 to 7. That simple astronomical fact might be the hidden spine of one of humanity's oldest stories, the tale of the 7 sisters and the mysteriously missing one. Gaia's data does something almost poetic. It takes myth by the hand and leads it back into the realm of measurable reality. By measuring positions and motions of more than 1 billion stars with exquisite precision, Gaia lets us rewind their orbits in time, like unspooling a film of the sky in reverse. When researchers do this for Pleione and Atlas, they find that tens of thousands of years ago, the apparent separation between them on the sky was large enough that human eyes under dark skies would have seen them as 2 distinct points. Imagine a small band of hunter-gatherers clustered around a fire on a cold night, one of them pointing a smoke-stained finger up toward the glittering darkness, counting aloud the tiny sparks on the shoulder of the celestial bull. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. To them, those 7 lights might have been the daughters of a sky god, or a group of sisters fleeing from danger, or spirits marking the turn of the seasons between plenty and hardship. As the millennia flowed on, Pleione's apparent position drifted closer to Atlas, following the quiet laws of gravity and orbital motion. At some moment no one recorded, but that the sky itself remembers. The 7th star became too close to Atlas for most human eyes to easily separate, except under the cleanest, darkest air. On one night a storyteller might still have counted 7, and on another, perhaps after smoke from the fire blurred the view or age clouded the eyes, they might have counted only 6. How would that feel? When the sky that once seemed so fixed suddenly changed by a single precious light. Across cultures you hear an echo of that moment. In the Greek tradition, the Pleiades are the daughters of Atlas and Pleione, pursued by Orion until Zeus sets them in the heavens. But one sister, Merope in some tellings, grows dim with shame for loving a mortal, hiding her face so that only 6 shine clearly. In many Aboriginal Australian stories, the 7 sisters are chased by a group of men represented by Orion, and in several versions one sister is caught or lost, leaving 6 bright ones in the sky. Similar ideas appear among peoples of Africa, in Japan's Subaru tradition, among Native American nations, in fragments of European folklore. Again and again there is a pattern of 7 that for some reason looks like 6. Carl Sagan once remarked that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And here the cosmos seems to be whispering its own continuity through our stories. A purely skeptical mind might say it is coincidence, that human beings have a natural fondness for the number 7, that our brains are good at spotting patterns even where none exist. But Gaia invites a gentler, more nuanced view, a place where myth is not dismissed, but reinterpreted as a kind of long-term observation. When a community watches the same patch of sky every clear night for hundreds of generations, they build up something that looks very much like data, except it is stored not in hard drives, but in ceremonies, songs and fireside tales. The astrophysicist Martin Rees once said that our universe has become aware of itself at least once. In us. If that is so, then the story of Pleione merging into Atlas is an example of that awareness stretching itself across unimaginable spans of time. From Paleolithic stargazers to 21st century space telescopes. To make this more tangible, think of a modern parallel. Imagine a small rural town where there is a lone tree at the center of a crossroads. Every child grows up using that tree as a landmark, meeting friends under its branches, building their games and memories around its silhouette. Then one year a storm strikes. The upper half of the tree is lost, and suddenly the shape of the crossroads changes. The stories adults tell about their childhood now have a bittersweet edge, and new tales arise about the night the tree was broken. The physics of wind and wood do not erase the emotional truth of those stories. They sit beneath them, like roots beneath the soil. Pleione's slow slide into Atlas is like that storm, except the storm takes tens of thousands of years, and the witnesses are entire cultures rather than a single town. When we say that one star has visually merged with another, we are using the language of astronomy. But for the people who watched it fade from 7 to 6, the language would have been of loss, of mystery, of divine displeasure or secret journeys in the sky. Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to remind us that the atoms in our bodies were forged in stars, that we are literally stardust. Gaia's reconstruction of Pleione and Atlas extends that idea a little further. Not only are we made of stars, but our oldest stories are woven from their changing patterns. The sky imprinting itself on our memory just as surely as it shaped our chemistry. From a scientific point of view, the lesson is clear and humbling. Even apparently fixed constellations are dynamic, their shapes just snapshots in a very long dance. What we call a cluster, a pattern, a mythic figure is drawn on water more than on stone. One day far in the future, the Pleiades will no longer look as they do now. Some stars will drift away. Others may brighten or dim. the familiar little hook of light on Taurus's shoulder will dissolve. Just as Gaia allowed us to look back 100,000 years, some future instrument may look back at us and say, "This was the age when humans told tales of 7 sisters and a lost sibling, and that too is now gone." On a more personal level, I like to think that the story of Pleiades and Atlas teaches us something about how to hold our own memories. We all carry constellations of moments inside us, bright points of joy and pain, mentors and friends, and lost loves. Over time, some of those stars drift together, others fade, and the patterns we once thought permanent rearrange themselves. We can respond by insisting the sky has betrayed us, or we can do what our ancestors seem to have done with the Pleiades: notice the change, weave a new story around it, and pass that story on as a form of wisdom. The global myth of the missing sister suggests that when something precious disappears, we rarely let it go in silence. We fold it into meaning, into narrative, into lessons about love and mortality. There is also a quiet, ethical thread running through this cosmic detective story. For our distant ancestors, paying close attention to the sky was not a luxury. It was life or death. The rising and setting of the Pleiades told them when to plant, when to travel, when the lean season was coming. Today we do not need to know when Pleione culminates at midnight in order to survive. Yet Gaia's work reminds us that paying deep attention to the world still matters. Whether that world is the orbit of a distant star or the emotional weather of the people close to us. Modern cosmology is sometimes accused of stripping the sky of its magic, turning gods into gas clouds and myths into mere mistakes. But here, with Pleione and Atlas, we see the opposite. Careful measurements do not kill the story. They enrich it, showing that our ancestors were not just telling fantasies. They were responding to real, observable shifts in the heavens and encoding those shifts in poetry. The lesson I draw from this is simple and profound at the same time. Science and story are not enemies. They are 2 ways the universe uses to talk to itself. So the next time you step outside on a clear night, find Taurus, look to its shoulder, and let your eyes rest on that tiny shimmering cluster. You may only see 6 bright points at first, but behind them lies the ghost of a 7th, the memory of migrations and campfires, the careful work of a space telescope sailing far beyond our atmosphere, and the quiet recognition that we are part of a story much older than any of us. In that soft, meditative gaze, somewhere between sleep and awakening, you are sharing a moment with people who lived 100,000 years ago and with scientists programming Gaia's instruments today. All of us looking at the same patch of sky. All of us wondering what it means when a single star seems to vanish. Why does a small, misty cluster of blue stars draw so many of the world's telescopes and cameras toward it night after night? When modern astrophotographers point their lenses at the Pleiades, they are not just chasing a postcard of the sky. They are chasing a feeling that something more is hidden there. At first glance, the cluster looks simple, a tiny handful of sparks resting on the shoulder of Taurus. Yet the deeper we look, the more it behaves like a doorway into layers of invisible structure. Around those young hot stars you see that soft blue haze that seems to pour and curl like breath on a frozen window. That glow is not fantasy added by a camera sensor. It is real interstellar dust, an ocean of microscopic grains floating between the stars. Each grain acts like a tiny mirror, scattering the starlight in all directions. And because shorter blue wavelengths are scattered more efficiently, the whole region takes on that ethereal sapphire sheen. Astronomers call this a reflection nebula, a place where light itself paints the dust. Carl Sagan once said that we are made of star stuff. And when you stare at the Pleiades, you can almost feel that sentence become literal, as if the same dust that now glows around those sisters once drifted through the clouds that formed our own sun and earth. To truly see that dust, however, human eyes are not enough. Our vision is fast, tuned for survival, not for patience. In the dark, our eyes gather photons for only a tiny fraction of a second before resetting the image. So anything faint is simply washed into blackness. A camera on a tripod with the shutter open for many seconds or minutes does the opposite. It practices radical patience. Every second, another small handful of photons from the dust and stars falls onto the past sensor, and the camera never forgets them. It stacks them quietly like pages of a book. After a while, a structure that was completely invisible to us begins to rise from the noise. Filaments of blue, subtle curls of shadow, dark rivers of dust cutting across the starlight. But there is a problem. While the camera waits, the Earth turns, dragging the sky along with it. Leave the shutter open too long, and the stars melt into streaks. Beautiful in their own way, but useless if you want crisp detail. This is where the star tracker enters like a quiet piece of magic, a small mount that rotates precisely opposite to the Earth, keeping the chosen stars frozen in place on the sensor. Suddenly, exposures of 2 minutes, 5 minutes, even longer become possible. And with each extra moment, the hidden structure of the Pleiades emerges more clearly. Imagine a photographer standing under a cold autumn sky in a silent field, laptop glowing faintly beside the telescope, watching as 100 separate exposures of the Pleiades slowly accumulate. The first frame shows only a faint blur around the stars. By the 10th, the blue dust is obvious. By the 50th, fine filaments and knots appear, like smoke caught in a beam of light inside a dark room. When the data is finally stacked and processed, something unexpected reveals itself near the edge of the frame. A tiny, elongated smudge that is not part of the cluster at all, but a galaxy hundreds of millions of light-years further away. This is another reason scientists and imagers love the Pleiades. It sits in front of the great depth of the universe like a translucent curtain. And when you look closely, you realize that beyond the curtain are entire cities of stars. The cluster itself is relatively close, about 444 light-years from Earth, practically our neighbor in galactic terms. But the small background galaxies that slip into the same image are hundreds of millions of light-years distant. Their light left long before humans even dreamed of constellations. On a flat photograph, they share the same patch of sky. Yet in depth, they are separated by an enormity that almost defies imagination. Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to remind us that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. And scenes like this are a perfect example. Our brains see closeness where physics insists on unimaginable distance. For astronomers, this overlap is not just visually poetic. It is scientifically rich. Studying the dust around the Pleiades teaches us how starlight interacts with the interstellar medium, how young hot stars carve cavities and sculpt filaments, how light can both reveal and conceal. In the same frame, the remote galaxies whisper about the large-scale structure of the cosmos, about how matter clumps under gravity over billions of years. One picture, taken by a patient human on a quiet night, becomes a bridge between local and deep time, between newborn stars and ancient galaxies. The great astronomer Edwin Hubble once wrote that equipped with his five senses, man explores the universe around him and calls the adventure science. The Pleiades is a gentle reminder that this adventure can also be deeply personal and emotional. That data and wonder are not enemies but companions. On a more human level, there is another reason this cluster captures so many hearts. It is approachable. Anyone with a modest camera, or even a small telescope, can point at that little cloud of light and bring home an image that contains both subtle dust and distant galaxies. In a world where much of cutting-edge astronomy belongs to giant observatories and space telescopes, the Pleiades offers a rare sense of shared ownership. When you photograph it, you are tracing the same shapes that ancient farmers watched as they decided when to plant. The same pattern that inspired myths of seven sisters and persistent stories about a missing star. The lesson for us may be simple yet profound. That patience and attention reveal layers of reality we cannot see at a glance. That the universe rewards those who sit in the dark a little longer. Personally, I find that every detailed image of the Pleiades feels like a small meditation. As if the act of gathering faint light over many minutes mirrors the way we slowly gather insight over a lifetime. At first, everything seems flat. Then patterns emerge. Then, behind those patterns, we begin to sense an even deeper background of meaning. Perhaps that is why this cluster has followed humanity from the first storytellers around ancient fires to the quiet glow of modern computer screens. It invites us to look again, and then again, and to realize that hidden history is not only out there in the dust and galaxies, but also inside the way we choose to see. Have you ever wondered how a small piece of glass and metal can turn the entire night sky into a private universe that fits inside a single frame? When astrophotographers talk about field of view, they are really talking about how wide your window into the cosmos is, and how much of that silent ocean of stars you allow to flow through your lens in a single heartbeat. A wide field feels like standing on a hilltop at midnight, with the whole sky wrapped around your shoulders, and a narrow field feels like leaning in close to whisper, with just one glowing star cluster. By changing the focal length, you are not simply zooming in the way you would on a smartphone, you are changing your relationship with space itself. A short focal length lets you feel the Earth spinning under rivers of starlight, while a long focal length pulls a distant nebula towards you until its delicate filaments fill the frame like brush strokes on dark velvet. As Ansel Adams once said about photography, you do not take a photograph, you make it. In astrophotography, that act of making begins with choosing how much of the universe to invite in. Imagine a cold night in the countryside, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and every sound feels far away. You set up your tripod, you point your camera at the Pleiades, and you decide to leave the shutter open for 2 full minutes. In that time, the Earth turns under your feet, and the stars would normally paint long arcs across the sensor, yet in the finished image they remain sharp and still, as if time itself paused to pose for you. The quiet magic behind this is the star tracker, a patient mechanical companion that turns in perfect opposition to the sky and gently cancels the Earth's rotation. Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to remind us that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. But in a way, a star tracker is our small attempt to meet the universe halfway, to move with it, so our cameras and our minds can see more clearly. Without tracking, those same 2 minutes would smear the stars into streaks, and the faint blue mist around the Pleiades would dissolve into noise and disappointment. With tracking, the dust clouds emerge, the colors deepen, and suddenly a patch of sky that looked like 6 little sparks to your naked eye becomes a vast glowing landscape of gas and dust and motion. For a farmer 10,000 years ago, learning to read those stars meant the difference between harvest and hunger. For a modern observer, learning to read focal length and field of view means the difference between a flat snapshot and an image that truly carries the weight of the heavens. Carl Sagan once said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." When you stand beneath the night and carefully choose your field of view, adjust your focal length, and let a star tracker follow the slow dance of the sky, you become part of that knowing. You learn patience, because the best images take time. You learn humility, because even when you zoom in as far as your equipment allows, the universe remains endlessly larger than your frame. And you learn presence, because for those few minutes of exposure, you are quietly aware of every click, every breeze, every distant sound, while light that left a star hundreds of years ago finally arrives to rest on your sensor. Perhaps the true lesson is this: when we try to steady the stars with our machines, we are really steadying ourselves, learning to slow down to follow the rhythm of the cosmos, and to see that behind every technical term there is an invitation to wonder and to rest inside that wonder for a little while. Have you noticed that even in the age of satellites and smartphones, people still go online at night and ask the same simple question? What is that little cluster of lights in the sky? Again and again, the answer comes back like a gentle joke of the cosmos. It's always Pleiades. This tiny gathering of blue stars has become a meme on social media. Yet behind the humor lies something almost sacred. An echo of how our ancestors once stared up and built stories around this shimmering knot of light. When a driver looks at the Subaru logo, they may see only 6 stylized stars on a car badge. But hidden in that design is the memory of the 7 sisters. A fragment of Japanese sky lore carried into modern industry. It is as if even our machines still carry constellations on their chests, reminding us that we are a species who once navigated by the heavens. Carl Sagan used to say we are made of star stuff, and you can feel that truth in the way we keep pulling Pleiades into our brands, our art, our conversations. Imagine someone in a city apartment, leaning out of the window on a cold evening, snapping a blurry picture of a fuzzy patch above the rooftops and posting it with the caption, "What is this?" They are not so different from a farmer 10,000 years ago, standing in a silent field and noticing that same cluster rising at a certain time of year. Back then, the appearance of Pleiades could signal planting or harvest, life or hunger. Today it signals curiosity and wonder, but the underlying gesture is the same. A small human being reaching out across the darkness and asking for meaning. Some researchers suggest that the myth of the 7 sisters may reach back tens of thousands of years, older than many languages. If that is even partly true, then Pleiades might be one of our first shared memories as a species. A story whispered around fires long before cities and screens. Maybe this is why the question still returns in every generation. Why are we so drawn to this tiny cluster? Because it is not just an astronomical object. It is a mirror for our own continuity. Proof that minds very much like ours once stood under a similar sky and felt the same pull in their chest. My own feeling is that Pleiades teaches a quiet lesson, that in a world obsessed with the new, there are patterns of wonder that never grow old. A small patch of stars can cross from mythology to car logos, from stone tools to digital cameras, and still keep its magic intact. It reminds us that beneath our technology, we are still storytellers, still sky watchers, still children of the same universe. And so when you next scroll past a photo asking, "What is this little cluster in the sky?" perhaps you will hear a deeper question humming underneath. How long have we been looking at this same light together? In the next part of our journey, We will leave the myths and memes for a moment and step back into the sky itself, asking a simpler but crucial question. What exactly is the Pleiades? And where does it sit in the great tapestry above us?